Hello children, in this video 3 of the same chapter, body fluids and circulation, I will be dealing with nodal tissues, cardiac cycle and ECG. The heart is provided with a specialized cardiac musculature called the nodal tissues. The speciality of this nodal tissue is that it can conduct action potential. Nodal tissue has the ability to conduct or generate action potential, and this action potential is propagated to the musculature of the heart and brings about contraction. So, the speciality of this nodal tissue is that it has the ability to conduct or generate action potential. Once the action potential gets propagated, that particular region of the heart musculature or cardiac musculature contracts. Now, let us see the distribution of the nodal tissue. It is indicated in yellow in both your text and on this diagram. There is a patch of this nodal tissue in the upper right corner of the right atrium. So, this is the right atrium, and on the right side, right corner, upper side, there is the sinoatrial node or SA node. It is called in brief or in abbreviation the SA node. There is a small patch of this nodal tissue called the SA node. The location is in the upper right corner of the right atrium. Then there is a small patch like this at the lower left corner of the same atrium, of the right atrium, and that is called the Atrioventricular node, or in brief it is called AV node. So, once again the distribution of the nodal tissue, there are two patches, a patch at the upper right corner of the right atrium called the SA node, and again a small patch at the lower left corner of the right atrium called the AV node. Then from this AV node, there are bundles of fibers. There is a bundle of fibers, nodal fibers, called the AV bundle. This AV bundle cuts through the atrioventricular septum. See, we know the septum that separates the atrium and the ventricle is the atrioventricular septum. So, it cuts or passes through the atrioventricular septum. See, this is the atrioventricular septum. It cuts through the atrioventricular septum and emerge on top of the interventricular septum. We know the septum that separates the two ventricles is the interventricular septum. See this. So, it emerges above the interventricular septum, and above the interventricular septum it splits or divides into two branches. See the yellow? It splits into two branches, and these two branches are called the left and right branches. See, and this goes down into the ventricles, and once they get into the ventricles, they supply or break into finer branches and supply the ventricles. These finer branches are called the Purkinje Fibers. So, once again, rising from the AVN, that is AV node, there is nodal fibers, and these nodal fibers are called the AV bundle, and the AV bundle cuts through which septum? It cuts through the atrioventricular septum, and above the interventricular septum, that is the septum separating the two ventricles, it splits into two or divides into two branches, and these two branches are called the left bundle branch and the right bundle branch. And these bundle branches goes down and redivide into finer branches, and these finer branches are known as the Purkinje Fibers. All these, starting from the AV bundle till the Purkinje Fibers, constitute the bundle of His. So, once again the distribution of the nodal tissue, as I told you, the nodal tissue is a specialized muscular tissue or cardiac musculature which has the ability to conduct action potential or generate action potential, and once it conducts the action potential, wherever it gets propagated, that particular part of the musculature, cardiac musculature, contracts. Now we are going to see the distribution of this nodal tissue. There is a patch of the nodal tissue in the upper right corner of the right atrium called the SA node. Then there is a small patch at the lower left corner of the same atrium, right atrium, that is called the AV node. Now arising from the AV node is a bundle of fibers called the nodal fibers, called the AV bundle, and this AV bundle cuts or passes through the septum that separates the atrium and the ventricle. That septum is called the Atrioventricular Septum, and above the interventricular septum it divides. What is that interventricular septum? The septum that separates the two ventricles. It divides, see the yellow branch, it divides into the right branch and the left branch, and they go down into the ventricles and redivide into finer branches, and these finest branches are known as the Purkinje Fibers. Now all these constitute, from AV bundle to the left bundle branch, the right bundle branch, Purkinje Fibers, all these constitute the bundle of His. Clear? So this is the distribution of the nodal tissue, and as I told you, it has the ability to generate, conduct the action potential, and wherever it's propagated, that particular musculature will contract. Now of this nodal tissue, the SA node is very important. It is called the pacemaker. SA node is called the pacemaker. Why it is called the pacemaker? It is the SA node that initiates the heartbeat or initiates the action potential and conducts it. So from here only it gets initiated, and because of that it's called the pacemaker. And not only that, it's also responsible for the rhythmic contractile activity of the heart. The heart has a rhythm. This contraction and relaxation has a rhythm. That rhythmicity is maintained by the SA node. So the SA node is called the pacemaker because of two reasons. One, it initiates the action potential or initiates the heartbeat, and second reason is that it maintains the heartbeat or maintains the rhythmic contractile activity of the heart. In this context, I wish to say that the human heart is called myogenic heart. Meaning of myogenic heart is the heartbeat is controlled by the muscles, and which musculature? The SA node. It is not controlled by the nervous system. It is not controlled by the brain. Okay. We have another option, neurogenic heart. Neurogenic heart is a heart that is controlled by the brain or by the nervous system. But the human heart is not controlled by the nervous system. It is controlled by the SA node, which is a piece of musculature, the nodal tissue. So it is called myogenic heart. Also we can refer to as it is auto-excitable. That is, it is controlled by itself. It is not controlled by the nervous system. Clear? Now, the next topic we are going to proceed is the cardiac cycle. And this you have studied in the 10th standard. When you studied in the 10th standard, we didn't bring the nodal tissue, but now in the 11th we learnt about the nodal tissue. So we have to incorporate into the different phases of the cardiac cycle the nodal tissue, the role of the nodal tissue. And very, very important, the nodal tissue plays an important role because it is the nodal tissue that is transmitting or propagating the action potential that brings about the contraction. Okay, so let's start with the first phase. First phase is the atrial systole. Second phase is the ventricular systole, and third phase is the joint diastole. Clear? And when you hear the word systole, remember contraction. So that will help you, it will lead you to the answer. So first phase, let's start with atrial systole. You can start with ventricular systole, you can start with joint diastole because it is cyclic. So whatever you started, you have to end it there because it's a cyclic process. I am going to start with atrial systole, and what should come to your mind? The atrium is contracting. In 10th standard when we learned atrial systole, we started with the atrium contracts and then what happens. But here very, very important, we have to give the role of the nodal tissues. So, my first point is going to be with respect to the nodal tissues. Conduction via the nodal tissues. Okay. So, here you have to recollect the nodal tissues. The SA node initiates the action potential and propagates it to the cardiac musculature of the atrium. So, with the diagram I am going to explain. Atrial systole, first we are talking about the role of the nodal tissue, the conduction via the nodal tissue. So, here the SA node initiates the heartbeat or initiates the action potential. When it initiates the action potential, it gets propagated where? To the two atria. And when it gets propagated to the atria, right atria and left atria, what will happen to the atrium? They get contracted. So, first you must talk with respect to the nodal tissue, very compulsory. You must talk, first point should be with respect to the conduction via the nodal tissue. So, here how you start, the SA node initiates action potential which is propagated to the cardiac musculature of the atrium or both the atria, and as a result both the atria contract. So, the second point is connected with the first point, both the atria contract, atria contracts. So, my second point is which chamber contracts? It is the atria contracts. So, you have to correlate with the nodal tissue. Once again, this SA node initiates action potential which is propagated to the different parts of the atrium, that is the right atrium and the left atrium, and so it is propagated. Because it is propagated, what happens to the musculature of both the atria? It contracts. So, this brings about the atrial contraction, both the atria contract. So, when the atria contract, what happens? The upper two chambers contract, what happens? The valves separating the atrium and the ventricle. Which are the two valves? The tricuspid and bicuspid valves. The tricuspid and bicuspid valves opens. So, it is understood, when the atria contracts, the valves opens up. The tricuspid of the right and the bicuspid of the left opens. So, that is the point related to the situation of the valves. Which valve open? The tricuspid and bicuspid valve opens. Meanwhile, our semilunar valves are closed. Okay. Now, what happens when the tricuspid and bicuspid valves are opened? So, here the bicuspid and tricuspid valves are open. Now, what happens? The blood flows from the atria into the ventricles. So, next we are going to see the next parameter is the flow of blood. The blood flows from the atria, both the atria, from the right atria to the right ventricle, from the left atria to the left ventricle. Blood flows from the atria to the ventricles. I hope you have understood. Atrial systole. Unlike 10th standard, we started off with the second point. In 10th standard, what we did, we started off with the contraction 1, 2 with respect to the valves and 3 with respect to the blood flow. No. In 11th standard, because we have learnt about the nodal tissue and its importance, first you have to start with the nodal tissue. Second is with the chamber that is contracting. Third is the status of the valve, and fourth is the flow of blood. So, these 4 points should be incorporated in each phase. So, once again I am going to describe the first phase, that is the atrial systole. So, you have to imagine this should be having a visual impact on you. You have to visualize the nodal tissue. So, let me start. The nodal tissue, that is the SA node, initiates the action potential, and this action potential, it gets propagated where? To both the atria, the right atrium as well as the left atrium. Both the atria receives the action potential. When both the atria receives the action potential, what happens? They contract. So, your second point is both the atria contract. Then it is common sense, when the atria contracts, there is a pressure exerted. So, the two doors open or the two valves open. the tricuspid and bicuspid valves on the right and left side opens. Then what happens when it opens? What is being filled when these two valves are opened? The ventricles get filled, or the flow of blood is from the atrium to the ventricles. I hope atrial systole is clear. Next, moving on to ventricular systole. Again with the help of the diagram. Now I told you the action potential was generated and propagated only to the atria. It has not reached the ventricles. How will it reach the ventricles? This action potential is picked up by the AV node. See, I told you there is another patch of nodal tissue at the left, lower left corner of the right atrium called the AV node. The AV node picks up this action potential, and then like the copper wire or the electric wire in your house, through this, it is through this bundle or through these fibers, it's propagated to different parts of the ventricles, like the electric wire of our houses. Okay, with the help of these fibers, it is transmitted where? To the different parts of the ventricles. So it's propagated to the ventricles. Therefore, the ventricles contract. So you must talk about the nodal tissue. How you will say the AV node picks up the action potential from the musculature, and from there it is propagated where? Via the AV bundle, then AV bundle where it goes to the left bundle branch, right bundle branch, then where it goes to the Purkinje fibers. Now what happened? It is supplying the entire ventricles, all the ventricles, all the muscles of the ventricles get the action potential. Now what happens? This causes the ventricles to contract. So that's how the ventricles contract. Unlike in 10th standard, what you learn, ventricular systole, ventricles contract, and from there you start off. But what's the cause of the ventricles to contract? Is this propagation of action potential from the AV node to the AV bundle, from the AV bundle to the left bundle branch to the right bundle branch, and Purkinje. So it has got propagated to different parts of the ventricles, and now the ventricles contract as a whole. Both the ventricles contract. Then use your common sense. When the ventricles contract, which valve will open? The valves called the semilunar valves. Semilunar valves, we know that these semilunar valves are guarding the aorta as well as the pulmonary artery. The pulmonary artery leaving the that is leaving the right ventricle and it's going to the lungs, and the aorta leaving the left ventricle and going to the different tissues. So here there is a valve, here and here there is a valve that opens. Why it opens? Because the ventricles are contracting. So with that pressure the valves open, the semilunar valves opens. Meanwhile, don't forget that time the tricuspid and bicuspid valves are shut. They are shut. Now what happens? Now talk about the status of the blood flow. Now because the valves are open, the blood flows out of the heart. That is, from the right ventricle, it goes out of the heart, means to the lungs, and from the left ventricle it goes out of the heart, that is to the tissues through the aorta. So the flow of blood is from ventricles out of the heart. You can be specific, that is, you can give this one's explain, that is from right ventricle to lungs and from left ventricle to tissues. Even you can be more specific by saying via which blood vessel. The lungs via pulmonary artery, and from the left ventricle to the tissues via the aorta. So there you can make it specific. So it's all this is, if only you have this in your mind and visualize and trace, you'll get all the points, and all the points are connected. Easily you can connect. Okay, so how we'll start is talking about the nodal tissue. The nodal tissue is, the action potential is picked up by the AV node, and from there it easily goes through these fibers which supplies the different parts of the ventricles. So, the action potential gets propagated to the musculature of the ventricles. This brings about the ventricular contraction, and when the ventricles contract, what happens? The semilunar valves that are guarding the aorta and the pulmonary artery opens, and when it opens, what happens? The blood flows out. Blood flows out means from the right ventricle goes to the lungs, and from the left ventricle goes out into the tissues. Okay. Next, the last phase is the joint diastole. Now, joint diastole, from the name itself, diastole means relaxation. So, you can get it, the clue you can get from the heading. First is atrial systole, then ventricular systole, joint diastole, and joint, it indicates all the 4 chambers. I am dealing with the second point, all 4 chambers are relaxed. Why it must have been relaxed? The question. Why? Because this stopped generating impulse. It cannot continuously supply the action potential. It stops. So, there is a pause. Pause. SA node that only initiated stops or pause, sending the action potential. It is not generated. Action potential or impulse is not generated by the SA node. There is a pause. And when there is this pause, what happens? There is no action potential propagating through the nodal tissue. As a result, all the chambers are relaxed. When all the chambers are relaxed, automatically what you can use your common sense and understand, the tricuspid valve and bicuspid valves are also open, because how they open? Only this contraction. But now when the chambers are relaxed, these 2 valves are open, tricuspid and bicuspid valves are open. So, the status of the valves, remember, the tricuspid and bicuspid valves are opened. Meanwhile, the semilunar valves are closed. Okay. Now, what happens? Now, which chamber is going to be filled? Use your common sense. All the chambers are relaxed. So, which chamber is going to be filled? It is the atrium that is going to be filled. Both the atria are going to be filled. Okay. Because the veins, see, this is the opening of the veins. When it was contracted, this shrinks and this closes the opening of the veins. But when it is relaxed, the veins open. See, the veins have opened. So, the veins are not provided with valves, because the opening and closing of the vein is brought about by the contraction of the atrium. When the atrium contracts, what happens to the opening or diameter of this vein? It shrinks. But now the atrium is relaxing, so now this is opened. It has opened. So, what happens? Blood gets in. Deoxygenated blood from the upper part and lower part of the body gets in through the superior vena cava and inferior vena cava into the right atrium. Similarly, this is a vein that is coming from the lungs. Now, as I told you, it is relaxed. So, what happens to the diameter or the opening of this vein? It is opened. The vein is open. The diameter is open. It is not shrunken. So, blood from the lungs get in to the left atrium. So, what happens here is filling of the atrium is taking place. So, atrial filling is occurring. Atrial filling is occurring. You know why atrial filling? Atrium gets filled only when it is relaxed, so that the openings are widened. Okay. But if the openings, if the atria contracts, what happens? Automatically this will shrink and the veins will close. So, they depend on the contraction and relaxation of the chamber for the entry of the blood, whether it is deoxygenated or oxygenated blood. So, here we see atria is being filled, and also I told you this tricuspid and bicuspid valves are also opened. So, what is being filled will also be filled in the ventricles. So, when the ventricles also are filled. So, all the chambers are being filled, but the ventricular filling is not forcible, not at all forcible. It becomes forcible. The filling of the ventricles becomes in force or at a force only if the atria contracts, but the atria is not contracted. So, there is some trickling of the blood from the atrium to the ventricle because it is open. Just because it is open, it's not closed. No, this valve is not closed. So, the blood drops into it, but it's not forceful. So, all the 4 chambers are relaxed. Atrial filling is taking place properly. Ventricular, there is filling, but we can see the filling like trickling. Drip by drip it's falling because the tricuspid and bicuspid valves are open, but proper filling is occurring in the atrium. So, with respect to all the 4 parameters I explained here, the first parameter I told you, the SA node stops generating action potential. So, all the chambers are standstill, that is relaxed. So, that is the second point, all 4 chambers are relaxed. At this time, the tricuspid and bicuspid valves are open and the semilunar valves are closed. And what is being filled? All the chambers are filled, but remember atria is being filled properly because the vein openings have widened because it is not shrunk. So, the filling of the right atrium through the by the superior vena cava and inferior vena cava, and the left atrium is being filled by the pulmonary vein coming from the lungs. Proper filling is taking place in the atria, but filling is also taking the ventricles, but not forcible. Just because the tricuspid and bicuspid valves are open, is trickling of the blood into the ventricles. So, having these in mind, you have to explain the 3 phases with respect to conduction via the nodal tissue, contraction of which chamber, status of the valves, and lastly the flow of blood. We are having the 3 phases: atrial systole, ventricular systole, and joint diastole. Clear? I hope cardiac cycle is clear. The notes also will be given to you. Next, we are going to calculate the cardiac output. So, how to calculate the cardiac output? So, to understand that, we have to learn certain parameters. Heart rate, the number of times a heart beats is nearly 70 to 75 times per minute. So, on an average we take 72 times per minute. So, heart rate, what is heart rate? The number of times the heart is beating per minute. It is found to be between 70 to 75 times per minute, but on an average we will take it as 72 per minute. Now, let us calculate the duration of one cardiac cycle. What is the time taken by one cardiac cycle? So, this can be calculated by time 60 divided by 72. That is, we have 72 beats per minute. So, in 1 minute 60 seconds, this divided by number of beats 72. This comes to 0.8 seconds. So, the duration of one cardiac cycle is 0.8 seconds. How did we calculate? The minutes is converted to seconds. 60 seconds divided by the number of heartbeats per minute, that is 72. So, 60 by 72 gives you 0.8 seconds. So, that is the duration of the cardiac cycle. Next is stroke volume. What is stroke volume? The volume of blood pumped by each ventricle during a cardiac cycle. So, what is stroke volume? Stroke volume is the volume of blood pumped by each ventricle during a cardiac cycle, and it is found to be 70 ml. Stroke volume is found to be 70 ml. 70 ml is being pumped by each ventricle during a cardiac cycle. Therefore, we are trying to find out cardiac outputs. So, let us find out calculation for cardiac output. Therefore, cardiac output is equal to heart rate into stroke volume. Substitute. Heart rate is 72. 72 into 70. Stroke volume is 70 ml. This is equal to 5000 ml, or we can convert into liters, 5 liters. So, this is a very small calculation, but important calculation. We are calculating the cardiac output. For that, we have to know these parameters. First one, heart rate, the number of heartbeat. What is heart rate? The number of heartbeats per minute. It is found to be between 70 to 75. So, we take an average 72 per minute. So, calculation of the duration of a cardiac cycle, 60 by 72 gives you 0.8 seconds is the duration of one cardiac cycle. Third, we are finding the stroke volume. What is stroke volume? Before that, we have to define the stroke volume. Volume of blood pumped by each ventricle during a cardiac cycle, and it is found to be 70 ml. So, cardiac output, the formula is heart rate into stroke volume. Heart rate is 72 into stroke volume 70, which gives 5000 ml, which is equivalent to 5 liters. So, this is how we calculate the cardiac output. Next, moving on to ECG. ECG also can be connected with our nodal tissues. This is the ECG, very simplest ECG is taken for your syllabus, where it shows 3 important curves. See here, this is the P wave. Follow the ECG, there is a P wave. This wave is the P wave. Then this wave which peaks up is the QRS complex, and we have the T wave. Okay. The P wave indicates atrial depolarization, or we can say atrial systole if you compare it with your cardiac cycle. QRS complex indicate ventricular depolarization or ventricular systole, and the T wave indicates ventricular repolarization, or it indicates the joint diastole. So, if you correlate with the cardiac cycle, you can see each wave is coinciding with the different phases. The P wave, you see there is a small P wave, then there is a very tall and thin peak called the QRS complex, then it dips and then comes up to form the T wave. The P wave indicates atrial systole or atrial depolarization. The QRS depicts ventricular systole or ventricular depolarization, and the T wave indicates joint diastole or ventricular repolarization. Why we are not saying atrial and ventricular repolarization, we are saying joint diastole, because already when the ventricular is in depolarized state, atria is already in repolarized state. So, we need not repeat atrial repolarization. It is understood when the ventricles are in depolarized state, the atria is in repolarized state, and it continues. The repolarization of the atria continues till the ventricles repolarize. Anyway, I am not making it much confusing, go with the simplest version. You can identify 3 peaks. The P wave indicates atrial depolarization or atrial systole. QRS complex indicates ventricular depolarization or ventricular systole, and T wave indicates ventricular repolarization or joint diastole. So, this is correlated with the cardiac cycle we learned. Any deviation from the shape indicates some abnormality of the heart or some cardiac disorder. So, this is of great clinical significance, clinical diagnostic significance. That is why ECG is checked. This is the normal, there can be slight fluctuation, but if it is too much deviating from this, it indicates some cardiac disorder. Clear? So, it is of clinical diagnostic significance. I hope you understood today's topics. starting from the nodal tissues and relating the nodal tissues to the cardiac cycle, then calculation of the cardiac output, and finally ECG. Again I connected ECG also with our cardiac cycle. So, this is very important, 3 and 5 marks questions can come from this portion of this chapter. Thank you.